Your diaphragm is leaking vital force, and deep breathing may be amplifying that leak instead of fixing it. The fatigue that persists even after rest, the mind that runs non-stop, the braced chest, and the feeling that nothing stays in you for more than a few minutes aren't born from a lack of energy. They're born from a silent internal leak, where the diaphragm stopped functioning as a containing membrane and started operating like an unlocked door, letting everything drain out before it settles. In this video, you're going to discover a 3-layer protocol that teaches your body to retain presence instead of chasing more air. Starting with a somatic test that reveals exactly where the leak is happening in your torso. During this test, there is a precise instant when the body recognizes its own pattern of dispersion, and that is where the reorganization begins. Leaving before that means continuing to live in micro-alert, expanding without ever containing, seeking energy that comes in but does not remain. What will be revealed here dismantles the idea that more air solves internal emptiness. The leak you feel is not only respiratory, it is a failure of somatic containment, where the diaphragm loses its function as a regulating membrane and begins to oscillate in micro-alert, unable to claim internal territory. This constant oscillation keeps the body in a state of semi-opening, where vital pressure enters but cannot be sustained, creating that clean fatigue that doesn't improve with rest and the persistent feeling that something essential is always draining away. In Hermetic texts, the body is described as a temple that must be sealed before it can transmute. Inner alchemy does not begin with expansion, but with living containment, where the center learns to retain before it creates. The diaphragm, in that language, functions as a seal that separates what is dense from what is subtle. And when that seal fails, vital force disperses before it can mature into act or presence. When the diaphragm remains in micro-alert, it creates a pattern of expansion without closure, where each breath opens but does not complete the retention cycle. That means intra-abdominal pressure never fully establishes. The center collapses right after filling, and the nervous system interprets that instability as a lack of safety. The result is a body that lives trying to recompose itself, but never settles, because the physiological base of containment has been lost. Research in polyvagal theory shows that vagal tone, responsible for signaling calm and safety to the brain, depends directly on how the diaphragm organizes pressure and movement. Studies on fascia reveal that tissue in chronic alert loses the ability to communicate stability to the nervous system, turning each breath into an attempt at regulation that fails right afterward. What these findings indicate is that deep breathing without reorganizing the containment pattern can in fact amplify the leak by expanding without teaching the body to retain. This matters because you may have learned to meditate, to breathe consciously, to seek presence, and still feel that nothing stays. The breath rises instead of descending. The chest remains rigid even after you exhale. The urge to sigh returns minutes after any technique, and the center remains empty. There is someone who lived this leak so viscerally that she came to question whether she was capable of sustaining anything in life, until she discovered that the problem was never a lack of effort. Beverly was 43 and worked as a caregiver for the elderly. Her routine involved long shifts, constant attention, and a silent demand to be present for other people while she felt herself emptying out. What led her to seek help was not an obvious collapse. but a subtle exhaustion that persisted even on days off, as if something inside her was always on, always ready, but never truly inhabited. Beverly's body exposed the leak in specific ways. Her chest lived braced, her shoulders rose with every inhale, and her abdomen seemed incapable of receiving air, as if there were an invisible barrier between the breath and the center. She sighed frequently, sometimes several times within a few minutes, without realizing that it was the nervous system's failed attempt to regulate itself. The fatigue didn't come from physical effort, but from a constant drainage, as if life entered her, but didn't remain long enough to become usable energy. This affected everything. Beverly avoided deep conversations because she couldn't sustain emotional presence for more than a few minutes. Simple decisions demanded disproportionate energy, and she began postponing commitments, not out of disinterest, but because she felt there was no internal ground to stand on. Relationships became superficial, not by choice, but because she couldn't maintain emotional intensity without feeling that something slipped away right afterward. She tried breathing therapies that taught her to inhale deeply through the nose and exhale through the mouth. She did guided meditations focused on chest expansion. She looked for grounding exercises that asked her to imagine roots coming out of her feet. None of that touched the root of the problem, because all of those approaches treated the symptom as a lack of air, when in truth it was a failure of containment. Beverly kept expanding without ever retaining, and the leak remained intact. The discovery came through something Beverly did not expect. During a conversation with the daughter of one of the elderly women she cared for, a woman who practiced somatic therapy and studied autonomic regulation, Beverly mentioned out loud for the first time the sensation that everything was draining out. The woman stopped, looked at Beverly with immediate recognition, and said that it had a name, a mechanism, and a solution. 2 weeks later, Beverly was in her first session with a therapist specialized in trauma and polyvagal theory. Someone who didn't ask her to breathe deeply, but to place her hands under her ribs and notice where the air rose instead of descending. Beverly felt something change the instant the therapist guided a gentle pressure under the costal margin while asking for a long, controlled exhale. It wasn't relaxation. It was the unprecedented sensation that something was staying instead of draining out. As if for the first time in years, the center had begun to retain presence instead of only processing movement. What Beverly discovered in that moment is exactly what you are going to experience now. Let's start by identifying where the leak happens in your body. Inhale deeply through your nose, the way you usually do, and observe carefully where the air goes first. If the shoulders rise, if the chest expands upward, if the throat gets tense, or if the abdomen remains rigid without receiving anything. You are seeing the dispersion pattern in action. That upward movement is the body trying to seek air instead of retaining pressure. And that is exactly why the breath doesn't settle. Now place one hand under the ribs on the left side, just below the costal arch, where the diaphragm connects with the abdominal wall. The pressure should be gentle, just enough for the tissue to register presence without forcing or massaging. Exhale long and controlled through the mouth, emptying completely, and as you exhale, keep that light pressure under the ribs. You will notice that the exhalation movement, when accompanied by subcostal pressure, begins to reorganize the diaphragm's tone, teaching the tissue to complete the containment cycle instead of remaining half open. Repeat this 3 times, keeping total attention on how the air descends instead of rising. On the 3rd exhale, notice whether the abdomen begins to receive movement, whether the chest stops being the protagonist of the breath, and whether there is a subtle sense that something is settling in the center. This settling is the beginning of internal retention, the body learning that it does not need to expand upward when it can anchor downward. Now move the hand to the right side, same position under the ribs, and repeat the cycle of 3 long exhales with gentle pressure. The right side usually has less diaphragmatic mobility because of the position of the liver, so it is common to feel more resistance here. Don't force it. Just keep exhaling long and allowing the subcostal pressure to converse with the tissue, indicating where the movement should happen. Observe whether the urge to sigh decreases, whether the breath begins to feel less urgent, whether the chest softens, even if subtly. Let your hands rest and breathe normally for a few cycles. Pay attention to how breathing happens now, without command. If the air descends more easily, if the abdomen participates in the movement, if there is less tension in the throat or shoulders, you are beginning to reorganize the containment pattern. The leak has not been completely sealed yet, but the body is receiving new information about how to retain instead of disperse. Now, let's go deeper. Place both hands under the ribs, one on each side, creating gentle bilateral pressure as you exhale long and controlled. This bilateral pressure teaches the diaphragm to descend in a balanced way without lateral compensations. Exhale until you empty completely and, at the end of the exhale, hold the air out for 2 seconds before inhaling again. This retention in emptiness creates an internal vacuum that pulls the diaphragm upward passively, reorganizing tone without active muscular effort. Repeat this cycle 5 times, keeping attention on how the center begins to feel less empty and more inhabitable. If you feel heat forming in the solar plexus region, if the abdomen feels denser, or if the breath begins to descend on its own even without manual pressure, the protocol is working. Before continuing to the next layer, there is something important about Beverly that will illuminate exactly what is happening in your body now. Beverly spent the first 3 days practicing the subcostal pressure and long exhale protocol whenever she felt her chest rise or the urge to sigh return. What she discovered was not relaxation, but functional containment. For the first time in years, the air descended into the lower belly without conscious effort. The center stopped collapsing right after filling, and the sensation of constant leakage began to give way. The body was learning that retention was not rigidity, but a living seal that allowed internal pressure to establish. The changes were specific and trackable. The frequency of sighs dropped from dozens per hour to 2 or 3 per day. Beverly was able to sustain deep conversations without feeling that something was draining out as she spoke. Work meetings that used to require emotional recovery afterward became just meetings, without disproportionate energetic cost. Sleep deepened because the body finally stopped operating in micro-alert during the night. Decisions that used to require days of deliberation began to resolve in hours, because there was a physiological base to remain within herself without dispersion. What Beverly felt in those first weeks, when the diaphragm stopped leaking vital force and began to retain presence, is exactly what you are beginning to notice now. The air descending, the center firming, the thinking slowing down. Let's continue. Now that the diaphragm has begun to reorganize tone and containment, we are going to create an axis of anchoring that teaches the nervous system to memorize this new pattern. Place one hand in the center of the sternum, between the nipples, and the other hand on the lower belly. 3 fingers below the navel. Breathe normally and feel the axis between these 2 hands, as if you were creating an internal column of pressure and presence. This gesture is not symbolic, it is tactile, teaching the body that there is a vertical path where the breath descends and vital force remains. Inhale through the nose, allowing the air to descend to the lower hand, filling the lower belly before expanding the chest. Exhale long through the mouth, keeping gentle pressure in both hands, as if you were sealing the axis between sternum and lower belly. Repeat this 7 times, keeping attention on how heat begins to form between the hands, on how the breath stops being an isolated event and becomes a movement of continuous containment. If the eyes stabilize, if the jaw softens, or if an internal silence arises that does not need to be manufactured, the body is integrating retention as a new autonomic pattern. Let your hands rest and breathe freely. Observe whether the breath continues to descend even without touch, whether the center maintains density, whether the chest remains loose instead of braced. This is the sign that the protocol reorganized intra-abdominal pressure and vagal tone, teaching the nervous system that safety does not come from hypervigilance, but from functional containment. The leak was interrupted, and what enters now stays long enough to become presence, focus, and act. The central practice is complete. The diaphragm learned to retain instead of disperse. The center claimed internal territory, and the breath stopped being an attempt at regulation to become a base of staying. Now comes the moment of sealing this transformation in the body so that it remains accessible whenever you need it. If the breath is descending into the lower belly without conscious command, if there is sustained heat between sternum and abdomen, if the urge to sigh has disappeared or drastically reduced, and if the gaze has stabilized without effort, the leak was interrupted. These signs are not subjective, they are physiological markers that the diaphragm reorganized tone and the nervous system registered containment as a new safety pattern. The body learned to retain presence instead of chasing more air. To anchor this state and make it accessible whenever you need it, use this gesture. Place the fingers of your right hand under the ribs on the left side, keeping gentle pressure, and the palm of your left hand on the lower belly. Exhale long 3 times, allowing the air to descend completely. This gesture takes between 30 and 60 seconds and can be done discreetly in any context, sitting, standing, or lying down. It functions as a tactile command that reactivates internal containment when the leak tries to return. When you feel the chest rise, the center empty, or the urge to sigh return in the next few days, do the anchoring gesture and repeat internally as you exhale. My center retains, my breath settles, my presence remains. This phrase is not an abstract affirmation. It is an instruction that the nervous system recognizes as a newly installed pattern. Use it whenever you notice the leak reappearing, especially in moments of tension, decision, or intense emotional demand. The seal is complete. The diaphragm stopped functioning as an unlocked door and returned to operating as a living membrane that regulates pressure, safety, and staying. What this opens in your life goes beyond breathing. You now sustain a body that has learned to retain presence instead of chasing more air. The breath descends without command. The center claims internal territory. And thought slows down because there is physiological ground for staying. This is not only a technique applied, it is a reorganization of the autonomic pattern that governs how you inhabit time, decision, and relationship. The leak was interrupted, and what enters now stays long enough to become act, focus, and creative potency. The protocol you just completed is one of the layers of a body that becomes an inhabitable temple. There are other practices that deepen containment, other membranes that need to be sealed, other somatic patterns that keep the nervous system in dispersion. Internal retention is a foundation, but a foundation opens the way for transmutation. And transmutation demands that each part of the body learn to hold the essential before it creates. Stephen Porges said, "Safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of internal connection that allows the body to settle. The diaphragm that retains vital force is the first gesture of real connection with yourself, where the body stops running after external regulation and finds an internal base that sustains without effort. When the body learns to contain, it becomes territory where the source can dwell without escaping. God does not create through dispersion, He creates through concentration. And a temple that leaks does not sustain sacred presence. What you sealed today is the capacity to be a living vessel, where energy, intention, and creation remain long enough to become concrete manifestation. If this content resonated in your body, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Share with someone you know who lives trying to recompose themselves but never settles. Consider becoming a channel member to support the continuity of this work and allow more people to have access to practices that integrate ancestral wisdom and somatic neuroscience with this depth. Write in the comments, "I restore my internal containment and my presence no longer drains away." When you put this into public words, the body anchors the experience and the nervous system memorizes the new pattern as conquered territory. To keep exploring how other somatic patterns keep the body in leakage, click the video that is appearing on the screen now. The diaphragm that retains is only the first sealed membrane. And when all layers of the body learn containment, you stop chasing energy and finally become territory where it remains.